COVID-19 has exposed a sickness in global society. It's exacerbated deep-rooted inequalities in the United States.
The wealth divide has just exploded in the wrong direction.
Structural inequalities is not healthy. It means we're leaving productivity on the table.
Around the world, migrant laborers are bearing the brunt of the crisis. And while rich nations are well into their vaccine campaigns, developing countries are falling behind.
We're not going to have as swift a recovery in the United States or in Europe if we don't make sure that everybody gets vaccinated.
2.5 million women have left the U.S. workforce due to the pandemic, while corporations face a growing demand to fulfill promises of inclusion.
Collectively, large companies have not done a great job on diversity.
You have to believe it's critical for your business.
As the world starts on a path to recovery, how do we ensure no one gets left behind?
The moment for radical change has arrived. Clearly the system is not working.
Trailblazers in business, technology, and public health convene to map out a more equal and inclusive future. It's time to move from words to action. This is the Bloomberg Equality Summit. Hello, I'm Carol Masser. The Bloomberg Equality Summit was held virtually as the U.S. marked 1 year since the start of the COVID-19 crisis. In the first months of 2021, new vaccines hold the promise of a return to normal. Even so, it's clear greater efforts will be needed to repair the social and economic damage of a pandemic that has exposed and deepened inequities across gender, class, and race. Leaders at the front lines of industry and policy came together at the summit to discuss how companies and institutions can work to close these gaps and bring about lasting change. The process starts with recognizing the stakes of the challenge.
It's become a vicious, destructive cycle where inequality has fueled the spread of the disease, and then the spread has created both health, economic, and education inequality that further fuels inequality. So I think the moment for radical change has arrived. Clearly the system is not working.
Everywhere you go, the majority of people believe that they should vaccinate their own country first, and they struggle to understand sometimes how important it is to open up economies in other countries, because every country is dependent on imports and exports.
The economic impact of the pandemic has fallen disproportionately on women's shoulders. For the first time in history, for example, the economic downturn in the US, we're seeing unemployment and income losses affecting women more than men.
This is not about doing a favor for women, people of color. This is about EPS. This is about higher EBITDA. This is about business, because we know from the research and the evidence that companies that are more diverse are more profitable.
One thing that COVID has revealed to all of us is that racial equity, structural racism is a thing. It always has been.
Listen, I think George Floyd and the uproar around George Floyd, when everybody saw a man get murdered in real life.
I am one who hopes that what we saw last year in terms of the uprising against the social injustice and the racism in the United States as well as in other countries, perhaps, and I hope, has reached an inflection point.
Women have had the most devastation, women and people of color, during this crisis. And so if we're going to have a full response and a swift response, we have to stop thinking as a world of gender equality as this nice thing to do when we get to it, or this side issue. No, it is the central issue. We are in a crisis for women and people of color in this country.
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been supporting vaccine research and global public health initiatives for decades. So co-chair Melinda Gates is well aware of the structural inequities complicating the fight against COVID-19. She shared how the vaccine rollout is progressing with Bloomberg's Emily Chang.
We still have a ways to go. We're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel here in the United States, but until all Americans are vaccinated, we still have a ways to go. But, it's going to be a while until the entire world is vaccinated. So this is going to still be with us the next few years. And I think we're going to have to really watch these variants that'll be bouncing around the world. That's actually still quite concerning.
What is it about the variants that concern you?
Well, because every time we know viruses mutate, but when they mutate, they can become sometimes more deadly or more contagious. And so anytime you see these mutations, we need to be on top of them in terms of surveillance. And then we're going to have to figure out, do we need to tune various vaccines to take care of them?
Your foundation has committed $1.75 billion to the fight against COVID. I know your team is very diligent about looking at where and how that money is spent. In your view, where is the vaccine rollout working and what's not working?
Well, I think it's working in some of our high-income countries. We're starting to finally see, much broader distribution, for instance, in the United States and in some of the European countries, but it is not at all working yet for middle and low-income countries. And, those are places where people are struggling. They have their loved ones who get ill. They can't get them to a hospital, much less an ICU. And so they are really still struggling in many countries around the world.
So there's obviously a moral case for vaccine equity, but what about the economic case? Why should somebody in New York or San Francisco care when somebody in Africa gets the vaccine?
Well, absolutely, it's the right moral thing to do. But economically, we're not going to have as swift a recovery in the United States or in Europe if we don't make sure that everybody gets vaccinated. Because what will happen is this disease, we know it crosses borders. We've seen it all over the world. And so as these variants break out, they will absolutely come back into the United States and Europe and Japan. And so our supply chains won't fully be up and running. We won't get our travel industry fully and leisure up and running, or the business community up and running in terms of travel. So economically, if we're going to reopen the global economy, we've got to take care of this everywhere.
Coming up, Sheryl Sandberg and why diversity and inclusion are top priorities at Facebook.
We believe that this has to be everyone's priority because it's good for our business. It's going to build better products that serve the people all over the world.
This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to a special look at highlights from the 4th annual Bloomberg Equality Summit. This year's theme, From Words to Action. After the police killing of George Floyd touched off mass protests last year, corporations rushed to affirm their commitments to diversity. In fact, the hiring of chief diversity officers spiked in the summer of 2020. Will this translate into lasting change? A Bloomberg survey of 100 corporations suggests that representation of minorities within their workforce continues to lag behind. Facebook's Sheryl Sandberg and Maxine Williams spoke with Bloomberg's Pamela Hutchinson about the social media giant's commitment to diversity and why it's critical to business.
I'm in every room because there is the assumption that there are inclusion issues in everything, and you don't want to just go to them when it occurs to you or as an afterthought. You want from the beginning that we are considering that in the way we would every other major issue. So it's integral. So I think that has been the major change for me, reporting to Sheryl and now participating in a broader range of meetings. And I think it's been great in terms of the impact because, again, we can get to things earlier. We have different perspectives in the room. I may know nothing about how to build a product, but I certainly know how the products we build impact the people who use them. And having that insight early on, I think, is just really beneficial to us and to the people we serve in the world.
Thanks, Sheryl. I know you want to say something.
Well, we hired Maxine 7.5 years ago. And it's actually really fun because Maxine and I have done a million things internally together. But I think this is our first public stage. So I was really excited to share her with the world because she's absolutely incredible. But look, we hired our chief diversity officer 7.5 years ago. The commitment to this has to come from the top. And having Maxine officially reporting to me puts her in every meeting. It puts her in my staff meetings, Mark's staff meetings. But what I would say to other companies thinking about doing this is there's lots of different structures and lots of different ways you can do it. But here's what you have to do. You have to believe it's critical for your business. We have to do this not just because it's the right thing to do, even though I want to be clear it is. Getting more women into leadership roles, getting more women into your company, getting more people of color into leadership roles and into your company, getting more women of color, because that's where the intersectionality of race and gender makes it the hardest challenges. We have to solve these problems for Black and Latinas, have to, for those women as well. You have to know that it's good for your business, because it is. There is so much data that diverse teams make better decisions, have better results. Look at coronavirus. I've been arguing that we need more female leaders for a long time. The countries run by women had lower death rates. If there was ever a proof point that more diversity of leadership and female leadership mattered, the world just handed it to us. And it's a very sad one, but it's one we should be paying attention to. We believe, not just me and Maxine, but Mark, our product leaders, our CTO, our Women at Group is sponsored by our CTO. Our Black at Group is our exec sponsor, is our head of our business, whole entire sales organization, who's white. We believe that this has to be everyone's priority because it's good for our business. It's going to build better products that serve the people all over the world. You have to believe that. And then everything else falls from there.
Another challenge in Silicon Valley, on Wall Street, and around the world is access to capital for businesses run by people of color and women. In fact, global venture capital funding for women-led startups dropped even lower to just 2.3% in 2020. However, some investors are determined to change the status quo. TPG co-CEO John Winkelried discussed his company's efforts with Bloomberg's Scarlett Fu.
One of the challenges that we face is getting diverse entrepreneurs capital, flowing capital to growing companies that are founded and led by diverse people. Until we solve the problem of putting diverse people into the seat of being capital allocators, running funds, and being able to use their networks to flow capital in that direction, I don't think we'll solve this problem. I don't think we'll make a lot of progress on it. So we've been working on this over the course of the last couple of years, really, and we've now developed an initiative internally at TPG to really brand this and drive this in a more systematic, institutional way. So the objective of TPG Next is seeding, supporting, and scaling the next generation of diverse investors and managers. And we're focused on women, people of color, LGBTQ individuals. So that's basically what it is.
Can you explain how investments in TPG Next differ from what you did with, say, Airbnb or Spotify or any of your other investments in the past?
Yeah, well, I mean, Next is really designed to be sort of the catalyst to get diverse people into seats where, whether it's private equity, whether it's venture, whether it's real estate, again, as you mentioned, horizontal, it's really designed to be the effectively seed and launch managers that will then ultimately go on to be themselves successful investors and successful allocators of capital.
That was TPG co-CEO John Winkelried, and TPG, by the way, also a sponsor of the Bloomberg Equality Summit. Now let's turn to another group that's been hit hard by the pandemic: children who have spent the past year in an environment of virtual education. Access to technology is critical to a student's success, but with vast inequalities in the digital space, millions are at risk of being left behind. Harlem Children's Zone President Jeffrey Canada offered the Biden administration advice on bridging the digital divide.
I think the first thing that the Biden administration should do is admit that digital connectivity is the equivalent of textbooks. And we can't pretend that some kids can learn without it. Whether you're using it all the time or part of the time or seldom, young people have to be able to access information. The other thing I think the Biden administration has to make sure is that families can afford to be connected. There's a lot more we could do if we take this moment and decide, let's really figure out the best practice an online instruction and when that can happen for our children.
Coming up, 2020 was a year of protest against institutional racism. John Rogers is confident that corporate America got the message.
There seems to be just this true commitment to thinking, like, what can we do better?
As for Ken Chenault, he says business leaders' actions have to catch up with their words.
There's some CEOs who have been in place for 10, 15, 20 years who tell me there's a pipeline issue. And I say, excuse me, you're controlling the pipeline.
This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to our special, highlights from the Bloomberg Equality Summit. The headline numbers show the jobs are starting to come back in the U.S., and yet underneath the surface, there are some disturbing trends. The unemployment rate for Black Americans rose in February, while the overall rate fell, underscoring how recovery from the coronavirus crisis remains uneven. Arrow Investments' John Rogers told Bloomberg's Sonali Basak that the pandemic exposed flaws in a system that was designed to help minority businesses.
Well, of course, when the pandemic hit, construction halted. People were, events stopped happening, so catering wasn't so important. Buildings closed, so janitorial services were not so important. But white Americans who were someone's accountant or lawyer or money manager or technology guru, those economies could do really well. Those businesses could thrive during this pandemic. So the wealth divide has just exploded in the wrong direction, partially because we have fallen into this trap of thinking about minority companies doing business in these sort of supply chain areas. At the University of Chicago, what we call it is business diversity, to show all the buyers that we want to be included in the parts of the economy where the wealth and jobs are created today. And we have the flexibility to work from home if necessary, if you have a tragedy like we had with this pandemic. So I think that is really at the heart of why things have gotten so much worse lately. And we have to change that and move this term business diversity, which we are doing here actually throughout Chicagoland. Our business community is starting to embrace that term and realize that supplier diversity is literally 40 years out of date.
So we have a question from the audience with our few minutes left, and it's what evidence or signs of hope do you see to move the discourse away from polarized views and towards universalization? Do you see the conversation changing?
Yes, the conversation is changing and pretty dramatically. After George Floyd's murder, the number of calls that I've gotten from CEOs from various businesses to come and speak about diversity and inclusion, there seems to be just this true commitment to thinking, like, what can we do better? On the boards that I'm on at McDonald's, Nike, New York Times, I'm having much more fulsome conversations with our management teams around what can we do, how can we ratchet up and get more done and really move the needle for the Black community. Where are the holes? What needs to begin? What needs to be done better? So I'm hopeful there. And then finally, we have a progressive congressional leadership, and that is helping. And a progressive president. People often look to Washington D.C. and get guidance and direction. And I think that's also helping to create some real tailwinds that are really creating more equal opportunity for minority entrepreneurs to do well and to maybe finally have access to being a customer. And I think that'll be very, very important.
From individual conversation, words, comes collective action. A coalition of leading U.S. companies has launched the 110 initiative, pledging to upskill, hire, and advance 1 million Black Americans over the next decade. Ken Chenault is a co-founder of 110, and he shared why he thinks it will work with Bloomberg's David Weston.
What we felt very strongly is that there was a need to get corporations collectively focused on this issue with a very specific target. 1 million jobs in 10 years. And what that meant was that each company had to make a financial commitment for 10 years and a jobs commitment for 10 years. Because we've got to be persistent at this, David. Many companies have tried this on their own. A few have been successful, but the reality is collectively, large companies have not done a great job on diversity. And part of it is we have to be more innovative and develop some approaches that will allow more Blacks to be in family-sustaining wages. There's nothing more ennobling than, in fact, to have a job. But it can't be a dead-end job.
So this is talking about entry level and above entry level, moving
And
people
above,
up the
yes.
chain.
Yes.
Let's talk about the top of the chain, because this is something that is much discussed, have been for a long time. I'm not sure how much progress we've really made at the top of the companies, and that's C-suite, that's boards, you name it, in terms of really having diversity and inclusion. You have a lot of experience with this, Ken. Where are we at this point? Do you think we have made progress?
I think we've made some progress, but if you look at the numbers, it's disappointing. So, David, there were more Black CEOs in the early 2000s than there are now. I think there were at one point 10 or 11 Black CEOs. I think there are 4. Ken Frazier stepping down from Merck after an incredible career, terrific CEO. But the reality is, you would have hoped that we would have had 30 CEOs of people of color. That has not happened. There's some CEOs who have been in place for 10, 15, 20 years who tell me there's a pipeline issue. And I say, excuse me, you're controlling the pipeline. For this upper rung, you can be very focused. You can say, who are 10 people in my organization that I think have the capabilities to move up and really make sure that getting the mentoring, the job assignments, you're holding them highly accountable for performance. But I don't think we've had this focus, and we haven't held people accountable.
Equality was a major issue for voters in the 2020 presidential election, and the new chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors has made it clear it will be a policy priority for the Biden administration. Princeton economist Cecilia Rouse is the first Black American to lead the council. She spoke with Bloomberg's Jacqueline Simmons at the summit.
Structural inequalities is not healthy. It means we're leaving productivity on the table. Just as we know that income inequality and wealth inequality is not helpful to economic growth. President Biden, Vice President Harris are really committed to ensuring that racial equity, that gender equity are infused throughout the federal government, throughout our policymaking. Fundamentally, what we can be doing at the federal level is ensuring that women and other caretakers, but there are disproportionately women, have the support that they need in order to balance their family responsibilities and their work. And I would also add ensuring that jobs pay well. So, with policies such as the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage has not been raised in 10 years. Ensuring that our home health workers have good jobs, that they don't have to be working 2 or 3 jobs and stitching them together in order to make a decent living. So I think those are some of the ways in which we ensure that women, especially people of color, are making a fair wage for fair work.
And that wraps up our recap of the Bloomberg Equality Summit. You can find much more coverage on the newly redesigned and expanded equality page at Bloomberg.com. It features analysis, information, and lots of reporting from teams throughout the global Bloomberg newsroom. Terminal clients can also get there through a new function, EQLY Go. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Carol Masser. This is Bloomberg.